He wasn't supposed to disobey. Not after everything they did to make him obey. The wind cut low across the gravel lot, carrying the faint scent of oil and cold iron, the kind that settles into your lungs and stays there longer than it should, and under the pale wash of a flickering warehouse light, the Doberman stood still inside a narrow metal crate, ribs faint beneath a dull black coat, ears cropped sharp but lifeless, eyes not wild, not afraid, just quiet, as if whatever fire had once lived there had been carefully turned down, not extinguished, just controlled, and a paper tag hung from the latch, no name, just a number, like something waiting to be cleared from inventory, while a few meters away, boots crunched softly over loose gravel, measured, hesitant, not the stride of authority, but of someone still learning how to carry it, and Ethan Caldwell stopped just outside the row of cages, hands buried deep in the pockets of his winter jacket, breath fogging in the early Ontario air, hovering just above freezing, his shoulders squared out of habit more than confidence, because confidence had been harder to find these days, ever since the call, the one they didn't talk about directly but never stopped referencing in glances, in silence, in the way conversations shifted when he entered the room, and even now, weeks later, it followed him like a second shadow, quiet, persistent, impossible to outrun, and he hadn't come here looking for redemption, not really. At least that's what he told himself, but something about the listing, retired K9, non-compliant, had lodged in his chest in a way he couldn't explain, and now here he was, standing in front of a dog that didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't even move as Ethan stepped closer, boots scraping lightly against concrete, until they were only a meter apart, separated by cold steel bars and something heavier, something neither of them could name yet, and for a long second, nothing happened. Just the hum of a distant generator, the faint rattle of loose chain somewhere down the row, and then the dog lifted his head, slow, deliberate, eyes meeting Ethan's, and there was no challenge in them, no submission either, just recognition, like two strangers realizing they had survived the same kind of storm, even if in different places, and Ethan exhaled softly, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his voice low, almost unsure of itself, "Hey," the word barely carrying, not a command, not even an invitation, just a presence, and the Doberman didn't respond the way a trained dog should, didn't sit, didn't focus, didn't wait for direction, he just held that gaze, steady, unflinching, as if measuring something deeper than tone or posture, and somewhere behind Ethan, a man's voice called out, casual, detached, that one doesn't take orders anymore, but Ethan didn't look back, didn't ask for clarification, because in that quiet space between them, something else was already forming, something not built on commands or correction, but on the simple, fragile possibility that not everything broken needed to be fixed the same way, and as the cold morning light crept a little higher over the edge of the warehouse roof, catching in the dog's dark eyes, there was the faintest shift, almost imperceptible, not a step, not a sound, just a softening, like a door somewhere deep inside had unlocked a fraction, not enough to change anything yet, but enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, neither of them had been meant to end here. The man at the far end of the row gave a short, indifferent shrug as he stepped closer, keys jingling faintly in his hand, the sound echoing too loudly in the hollow space. "Came in 3 months ago," he said, voice flat, practiced, like he had repeated the same explanation too many times to care anymore. "Police unit out west, Alberta maybe. They marked him non-compliant after evaluation, failed response tests. Would not engage when commanded." He paused, glancing at the Doberman with a hint of annoyance rather than concern, not useful anymore, and the word useful hung in the air longer than it should have, heavy, misplaced, as if it did not belong to something that could look back the way this dog did, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, not yet, just a quiet resistance to the idea that a living being could be reduced to a line on a report, a checkbox marked incomplete. And he shifted his weight slightly, boots scraping against the concrete as he crouched down, lowering himself to the dog's level without thinking, instinct rather than decision, the cold seeping through the fabric of his pants, but he did not move away, his gaze steady, softer now. "What is his name?" he asked, not looking at the man, and there was a brief pause, just long enough to say everything. "Does not have one anymore," the man replied, already turning a page on his clipboard. They cleared his file, and something about that felt worse than any scar Ethan could see, because it meant erasure, not just failure, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between the bars, to the quiet breath of the dog, to the faint rise and fall of his chest, and Ethan reached out slowly, not touching, not yet, just letting his hand rest near the edge of the crate, fingers relaxed, open, offering nothing but presence, and the Doberman watched, unblinking, then lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to acknowledgement, as if recognizing a language that did not require commands, and behind them, the man cleared his throat. Auction starts in 20 minutes. He said, if you are interested, you will need to register, but Ethan did not stand, did not rush. Time seemed to move differently here, stretched thin between moments, and in that stillness, something surfaced, uninvited, a memory he had tried to keep buried, flashing not as images but as feeling, the weight of a decision made too quickly, the echo of a voice over the radio, the silence that followed, and he swallowed hard, jaw tightening, eyes flickering just for a second before returning to the dog, because there was something in that quiet gaze that did not judge, did not accuse, it simply existed, steady, present, and for the first time in weeks, the noise inside his head eased, not gone, but quieter, like snow falling over a restless landscape, softening the edges, and he let out a slow breath, barely audible. Yeah, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, I know how that feels, and the Doberman shifted then, just a fraction, enough that the chain attached to his collar gave a faint, metallic whisper, but instead of stepping back, he leaned forward, closing the distance by a few centimeters, stopping just short of the bars, close enough that Ethan could see the fine detail in his eyes, the faint reflection of the overhead light, the depth beneath it, and it was not emptiness, not at all, it was restraint, controlled, deliberate, as if everything that dog had ever been taught was still there, just held back, waiting for a reason to surface again, and Ethan slowly curled his fingers against the cold metal, grounding himself in something real, something present, while the sounds of the warehouse began to rise around them, voices gathering, footsteps approaching, the low murmur of bidders arriving, but none of it seemed to reach the space between them, not yet, because for those few seconds, it was just a man who had made a mistake and a dog who had been defined by one, both standing at the edge of something neither of them fully understood, but neither of them turning away. The voices grew louder as more people filtered into the warehouse, boots dragging in bits of gravel, coats rustling, the low murmur of conversation carrying the familiar tone of transaction rather than care, and Ethan finally stood, slow and deliberate, like he was leaving something unfinished behind him, though his eyes lingered on the Doberman for a second longer than necessary, as if committing that quiet presence to memory before stepping back into the noise, and the man with the clipboard waved him toward a folding table set near the entrance where a stack of forms waited under a dim lamp. Sign here, identification, badge number if you are law enforcement, he said, barely looking up, and Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into his jacket, pulling out his wallet, the motion automatic but heavier than usual, as if even that small act carried weight now. And he placed his identification on the table, the plastic card catching the light briefly, reflecting a version of himself that felt distant, someone who had once moved through decisions with certainty, someone who did not second-guess the sound of his own voice, and the man scribbled something down, slid a numbered paddle across the table, and Ethan picked it up without really looking at it, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge as the room shifted from waiting to expectation, and somewhere behind him, a metal latch clicked open, followed by the scrape of crates being adjusted, dogs shifting, chains whispering softly against steel, none of it loud, none of it chaotic, just controlled, orderly, and that made it feel colder somehow, like everything here had already been decided long before anyone raised a hand to bid, and Ethan moved back toward the edge of the crowd, positioning himself where he could still see the Doberman's crate from a distance of maybe 5 meters, far enough to blend in, close enough to not lose sight, and the auctioneer stepped up onto a small platform, voice carrying easily through the space without effort, practiced, detached. We will begin shortly, he announced, flipping through a clipboard of his own, all units are as listed, no guarantees, no returns, and the words landed flat, transactional, but Ethan barely registered them because his attention had already drifted back to the dog, who had not moved much at all, still standing, still watching, though now there was something different in the way he held himself, not tension, not readiness, something quieter, like waiting without expectation, and Ethan felt that same unfamiliar pull again. That sense that this moment mattered in a way he could not explain, and as the first crate was rolled forward and bidding began, numbers called out in quick succession, voices overlapping, the rhythm sharp and efficient. Ethan stayed silent, observing, his grip on the paddle steady but unused, because this was not impulse, not yet, it was something slower, something building beneath the surface, and then, after what felt like too many minutes and not enough at the same time, the Doberman's crate was brought forward, metal wheels squeaking softly as it came to rest under the light, the tag still hanging from the latch, catching a dull glint, and the auctioneer glanced down briefly, then up again. Retired K9, non-compliant, no service guarantee, he read, voice unchanged, we will start low, and a few scattered murmurs moved through the crowd, interest thin, uncertain, and Ethan felt a quiet shift inside him, something aligning, not driven by logic or duty or even guilt, but by something simpler, something more stubborn. And before he could overthink it, before the past could reach forward and pull him back again, his hand lifted, steady, deliberate, the paddle rising just enough to be seen, not dramatic, not urgent, just present, like a decision that had already been made long before this moment arrived. The auctioneer barely paused when Ethan's paddle lifted, just a slight nod, a shift in tone that acknowledged the bid without attaching meaning to it. Thank you, we have an opening, he said, voice smooth, practiced, and for a moment the room seemed to lean in, not out of interest, but curiosity, as if wondering why anyone would start where no one else had, and a second voice followed, hesitant, from somewhere near the back, raising the number by a small margin, not enough to suggest conviction, just enough to test the space, and Ethan did not look around, did not try to identify the other bidder, his focus stayed fixed on the Doberman, who stood under the harsh light without reacting to the noise, without tracking the voices, as if the entire exchange happening around him existed in a different world, one he no longer responded to, and Ethan felt something settle deeper inside his chest, a quiet certainty, not loud, not urgent, just present, and he raised his paddle again, steady, unhurried, the motion almost calm, and the auctioneer responded immediately, numbers moving in small increments, each call echoing softly against the metal walls, while the second bidder hesitated this time, a longer pause, a shift of weight, the faint sound of a coat sleeve brushing against fabric, then another bid, slightly higher, still cautious, and Ethan exhaled slowly, breath visible in the cold air, his grip tightening just enough to feel it, grounding himself in the moment, because somewhere beneath the surface, the old instinct stirred, the one that questioned, calculated, weighed risk and outcome, but he let it pass, did not engage it, because this was not that kind of decision, and when he lifted the paddle again, there was no hesitation at all, just a quiet finality, and the room seemed to recognize it, the subtle shift in energy, the way certainty changes the air even when no one speaks of it, and the other bidder did not follow, their silence stretching just long enough for the auctioneer to glance up, scanning briefly, then calling out once, twice, the rhythm familiar, closing in, going once, he said, voice carrying, going twice, and Ethan did not move, did not react, his eyes still on the dog, who now stood closer to the front of the crate, not pressing forward, not retreating, just there, present, watching, and then the final word came, clean, definitive, sold, and the sound of the small wooden gavel striking the surface echoed sharper than anything else in the room, not loud, but precise, marking the end of something and the beginning of something else neither of them fully understood yet, and for a second, nothing changed, the room continued its motion, the next crate already being prepared, voices shifting, attention moving on, but Ethan remained where he was, the paddle lowering slowly in his hand, the weight of it suddenly insignificant compared to what had just happened, and across the few meters that separated them. The Doberman held his gaze, steady, unblinking, and there was no visible reaction, no wag of a tail, no sign of recognition in the way people expect it, but something had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a line that had been drawn quietly between them, not by ownership, not by command, but by choice, and as the man with the clipboard approached again, keys already in hand, Ethan finally took a step forward, boots firm against the concrete, the distance closing not just in space, but in something deeper, something neither of them had words for yet, but both of them seemed to understand all the same. The keys rattled softly as the man stepped in front of the crate, metal brushing against metal with a dull, familiar sound, and for the first time since Ethan had entered the warehouse, the space between him and the Doberman shifted from observation to action, subtle but undeniable, and Ethan felt it immediately, that quiet tension that comes just before something changes, not sharp, not aggressive, just present, and he slowed his approach without thinking, stopping about a meter away as the man crouched down and reached for the latch. Careful, he muttered, more out of routine than concern. He does not respond the way you expect, but Ethan did not answer, his attention fixed on the dog, on the way his posture remained steady, not defensive, not compliant, just aware, and when the latch finally clicked open, the sound echoed louder than it should have, a small, metallic release that seemed to ripple through the air, and the door creaked slightly as it was pulled back, leaving an opening that no one rushed to fill, not the man, not Ethan, not even the dog, because for a moment, all three of them paused, as if waiting to see which version of this moment would unfold, the one defined by training or the one defined by choice, and then the man stepped back, giving space with a quick gesture, already losing interest, already moving on, while Ethan remained where he was, shoulders relaxed, hands visible, not reaching, not commanding, just present, and the Doberman did not move immediately, his eyes flicking once toward the open space, then back to Ethan, measuring, weighing something unseen, and Ethan felt his breath slow, deliberate, grounding himself in the quiet, because this was not about control, not about proving anything, it was about allowing something to happen without forcing it, and after a long second, the dog shifted forward, one careful step, then another, paused silent against the cold concrete, the chain dragging lightly behind him with a soft metallic whisper, and when he crossed the threshold of the crate, there was no sudden change, no burst of movement, just a continuation of that same quiet presence, now closer, now real, and he stopped a short distance from Ethan, maybe half a meter, close enough that the faint warmth of his breath met the cold air between them, and Ethan resisted the instinct to reach out too quickly, instead lowering himself slowly to one knee, bringing himself level again, reducing the space not just physically but emotionally, and he extended his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed, offering nothing but time, and for a moment, nothing happened, the dog remained still, eyes steady, reading, not reacting, and then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned forward, just enough that his nose hovered near Ethan's hand. Not touching, just there, sensing, and Ethan held still, not even shifting his weight, because he understood, somehow, that this was not about contact, it was about trust forming in the smallest possible increments, and after another second, the dog exhaled softly, a quiet release, and that was enough, more than enough, because it was not resistance, not rejection, it was something else, something that felt like the beginning of an agreement neither of them needed to speak aloud, and behind them, the warehouse noise continued, distant, fading into the background as the world narrowed once more to this small, quiet exchange, where no commands were given, no expectations set, just two beings standing in the fragile space between what they had been and what they might still become. The moment stretched just long enough to feel real before it began to shift again, not with urgency, but with quiet inevitability, and Ethan slowly withdrew his hand, not as rejection, but as respect, giving the dog space to decide what came next, and the Doberman did not retreat, did not step back into the crate, instead he remained where he was, standing in that open threshold between confinement and something else, something unfamiliar, and the chain at his collar gave a faint sound as he turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the wider space now, the movement measured, controlled, like someone relearning how to exist beyond boundaries that had once been absolute, and Ethan rose carefully to his feet, every motion deliberate, mindful not to break the fragile understanding that had formed between them, and he reached for the length of the chain, not pulling, not tightening, just holding it loosely in his hand, the cold metal grounding him, reminding him that this was not symbolic, this was real, and for a second, the dog's muscles tensed, not aggressively, but reflexively, a memory passing through him faster than thought, and Ethan noticed it, of course he did, but he did not react, did not correct, he simply waited, breath steady, posture open, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension eased, the dog's stance settling again into that quiet stillness that seemed to define him now, and together, without a word, they took their first steps forward, moving out of the harsh light of the auction area and into the colder, quieter edge of the warehouse, where the sounds of bidding faded into the background, replaced by the distant hum of machinery. And the soft echo of their own movement across the concrete floor, and it felt strange, walking beside something that had once been trained to walk beside someone else, something that carried history in the way it moved, in the way it watched, in the way it chose not to react, and Ethan found himself adjusting unconsciously, matching that pace, that silence, not leading, not following, just aligning. And when they reached the large sliding door at the side of the building, the man with the clipboard appeared again, pushing it open with a heavy metallic groan that let the outside air spill in, colder, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant snow, and for a moment, both Ethan and the dog paused at the threshold, the world beyond stretching wide and open, the sky pale and overcast, the ground dusted with a thin layer of frost that crunched softly underfoot, and the Doberman hesitated, just slightly, his gaze fixed on the open space ahead, as if measuring something unseen, something deeper than distance, and Ethan felt it too, that hesitation, that quiet resistance to stepping into something unknown, and he did not pull the chain, did not urge him forward, he simply stepped out first, one foot, then the other, boots pressing into the frost with a soft, steady sound, and after a second, the dog followed, crossing the threshold with the same careful deliberation, the chain between them hanging loose, unforced, and as the door slid shut behind them with a heavy, final sound, the noise of the warehouse sealed away, what remained was silence, wide and open, stretching across the empty lot and into the trees beyond, and for the first time since that morning had begun, there was no structure, no command, no expectation, just cold air, quiet ground, and two figures standing side by side in a space that did not yet ask anything of them, and in that silence, something shifted again, softer this time, almost like relief, though neither of them would have named it that yet. The cold settled deeper the longer they stood there, not biting, not harsh, just steady, like the kind of quiet that asks nothing but still feels heavy if you carry too much inside it, and Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on the loose chain, not to control, just to remind himself that he was not alone in this moment, and the Doberman stood beside him, head level, ears alert but not rigid, eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of the lot where the wind moved softly through branches dusted with frost, and for a few seconds neither of them moved, as if both were waiting for something to define what came next, some signal, some command, something familiar to step into, but nothing came, only the faint crunch of ice under a distant passing vehicle somewhere beyond the road, and Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the air before speaking, his voice low, steady. "All right, we start simple." The words more for himself than for the dog, and he took a step forward. Not looking back, not checking, just moving with quiet intention, boots pressing into the thin frost with a soft, consistent rhythm, and after a brief pause, the dog followed, not immediately at heel, not perfectly aligned, but close enough to suggest awareness, to suggest choice rather than conditioning, and Ethan noticed it without turning, the subtle sound of paws against frozen ground, the faint drag of chain that was not being pulled, and something in his chest eased again, just a fraction, because this was not obedience, this was something else, something slower, something earned. And they walked that way across the lot, maybe 10 meters, maybe a little more, until the open space gave way to a narrow path leading toward a line of sparse trees, the kind that marked the edge between managed land and something more natural, and Ethan stopped there, turning slightly now, not abrupt, not commanding, just enough to bring himself into the dog's line of sight, and he gestured gently with his hand, palm open, a quiet invitation rather than an instruction. And the Doberman tilted his head just slightly, not confused, not uncertain. Just observing, and then he stepped closer, closing the small gap between them without hesitation, and Ethan nodded once, almost unconsciously, acknowledging something that had not been spoken but clearly understood, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a pair of gloves, slipping them on slowly as the cold began to settle into his fingers, and the small movement seemed to trigger something subtle in the dog. A brief tightening in posture, a flicker of memory passing through his frame. And Ethan caught it immediately, pausing mid-motion, letting his hands still, lowering them slightly, and after a moment, the tension eased again, fading as quickly as it had appeared, and Ethan made a quiet note of it without words, something to remember, not to fix yet, just to understand later, and he finished adjusting the gloves before taking another step forward onto the path, this time slower, more deliberate. Allowing space, allowing time, and the Doberman followed again, closer now. Not perfectly aligned, but no longer distant either, his presence steady at Ethan's side, and as they moved into the trees, the sounds of the open lot faded behind them, replaced by the soft hush of wind through branches and the muted rhythm of their movement, and for the first time since the day had begun, it did not feel like they were leaving something behind, it felt like they were entering something. Not defined, not certain, but quiet, and for now, that was enough. The trees closed in gently as they moved deeper along the narrow path, not dense enough to block the light but enough to soften it, turning the pale gray sky into something quieter, something less exposed, and the ground beneath their feet shifted from frozen gravel to a thin layer of soil and fallen needles, the sound of each step becoming softer, more absorbed, as if the world itself was trying not to disturb them. And Ethan slowed his pace without realizing it, his breathing steady. Shoulders easing slightly as the distance between him and the warehouse grew not just in meters but in weight, and beside him, the Doberman adjusted as well, his movements less guarded now, though still deliberate, each step placed with care, as if he had learned long ago that even the smallest motion could carry consequence, and for a while they walked in silence, the kind that does not demand to be filled, the kind that allows thoughts to surface and pass without being forced into words, and Ethan found his mind drifting again, not to the noise of the present but to the quiet echo of the past, the memory that lingered like a shadow just out of view, the moment when a decision had been made too quickly, when certainty had replaced caution, and the outcome had not been something he could undo, and his jaw tightened slightly, the familiar tension returning just enough to remind him it was still there, still unresolved. And as if sensing the shift, the Doberman's pace faltered for a fraction of a second, not stopping, just adjusting, his head turning slightly toward Ethan, not seeking direction, not reacting to a command, just noticing, and Ethan caught it, that subtle awareness, and something in his chest eased again, because it was not expectation, it was presence, and he let out a quiet breath, slower this time, allowing the tension to settle rather than push against it, and after a few more steps, he stopped near a small clearing where the trees opened just enough to let a wider stretch of light through, the ground here less frozen, patches of dark earth visible beneath the frost, and he turned slightly, looking down at the dog, who had stopped as well, standing just within arm's reach, close but not crowded, and for a moment, Ethan hesitated, not out of fear, but out of unfamiliarity, because he realized he did not know what came next. There was no protocol for this, no structured sequence of commands to follow, just a quiet space and a living being who was not responding to the usual rules, and he exhaled softly, reaching into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small piece of dried food he had taken without thinking earlier, holding it loosely between his fingers, not offering it forward immediately, just letting the scent carry in the cold air, and the Doberman's ears flicked slightly, a small reaction, controlled, restrained, and his gaze shifted to the hand, then back to Ethan's face, as if weighing more than just the object being offered, and Ethan waited, not rushing, not encouraging, simply allowing the moment to unfold, and after a few seconds, the dog stepped forward, one careful step, then another, closing the distance until he stood just in front of Ethan, his breath visible in the cold air, steady, calm, and he lowered his head slightly, not submissive, not hesitant, just enough to acknowledge the offering, and Ethan extended his hand slowly, placing the food within reach, and for a moment the dog did not take it, just held there, still, as if testing something deeper than hunger, and then, gently, he accepted it, not snapping, not eager, just controlled, deliberate, and Ethan felt something shift again, quiet but real, because it was not about the food, it was about the choice, and as the dog stepped back, chewing slowly, the sound soft against the silence of the trees, Ethan allowed himself a small nod, not of success, but of understanding, because this was how it would begin, not with commands, not with correction, but with moments like this, small, patient, earned, one at a time. The clearing held its quiet like a breath that had not yet been released, the kind that settled gently into the spaces between movement and thought, and Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the Doberman finish the small piece of food, not with urgency, not with hunger, but with a measured calm that felt almost intentional, as if even something as simple as eating required a decision now. And when the dog lifted his head again, there was no expectation in his posture, no anticipation of more, just a steady presence, grounded, aware, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the air fogging briefly before fading into the stillness, his gaze drifting for a second toward the line of trees beyond the clearing, their branches bare but strong, holding against the quiet weight of winter, and something about that steadiness lingered with him, because it felt familiar in a way he could not quite name, and he shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the softer earth beneath the frost, grounding himself in the moment before reaching into his pocket again, not for food this time, but for something else, something smaller, and he pulled out a worn piece of fabric, a simple training cloth he had carried without thinking, habit more than intention, and he held it loosely in his hand, letting it hang at his side for a second before lifting it just enough to be seen, not presenting it as a command, not associating it with any expectation, just allowing it to exist in the space between them, and the Doberman's reaction was immediate, not outward, not obvious, but real, a slight tightening in the shoulders, a flicker in the eyes, something deeper than recognition, something closer to memory, and Ethan saw it, of course he did, the subtle shift that spoke louder than any bark or movement, and he stilled completely, not withdrawing, not advancing, simply holding the moment where it was, allowing the dog to process without pressure, and for a few seconds, nothing changed, the air remained still, the trees quiet, the distance between them unchanged, but beneath that stillness, something moved, something unseen, and the dog's gaze fixed on the cloth, not with fear, not exactly, but with caution shaped by experience, and Ethan felt that weight, that invisible history pressing into the present, and slowly, carefully, he lowered the cloth back down, removing it from focus without sudden movement, without dismissal, just easing it out of the moment, and the change was immediate, subtle but clear, the tension in the dog's posture releasing again, the stillness returning, and Ethan nodded slightly to himself, not in frustration, not in disappointment, but in understanding, because this was not about teaching, not yet, this was about listening, about noticing the things that were not said, the reactions that did not need explanation, and he let the cloth rest back in his pocket, his hand lingering there for a second before falling to his side, and he looked at the dog again, really looked this time, beyond the surface, beyond the training, beyond the label that had been placed on him, and what he saw was not defiance, not failure, but restraint, controlled, deliberate, as if something inside had been shaped to respond and then told not to, and he exhaled slowly, the realization settling quietly, because this was not a dog that could not follow commands, this was a dog that chose when to, and that choice had been shaped by something deeper than simple training, something that had not been explained, not in any report, not in any file, and as the wind shifted slightly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant snow, Ethan straightened a little, his posture aligning not with authority, but with purpose, quiet and steady, and without a word, he turned slightly, stepping toward the deeper path beyond the clearing, not looking back, not calling, just moving forward with the same calm intention as before, and after a brief pause, the Doberman followed, closer now than before, not by command, not by force, but by something else entirely, something that neither of them had named yet, but both of them seemed to trust. The path narrowed as they moved deeper, the trees growing closer together, their branches reaching inward just enough to filter the light into thin, quiet strands that stretched across the ground, and Ethan adjusted his pace again, slower now, more deliberate, each step placed with intention rather than direction, and the air felt different here, less open, more contained, carrying the faint scent of damp earth beneath the frost. A reminder that even in the stillness of winter, something beneath the surface remained alive, waiting, and beside him, the Doberman stayed close, not pressed against his side, not perfectly aligned, but near enough that their movement felt connected, not by command, but by choice, and for a while, they walked without interruption, the rhythm of boots and paws blending into a quiet cadence that did not need to be explained, and then, somewhere ahead, a sound broke the stillness, faint but distinct, the sharp, repetitive crack of something mechanical. Distant but clear enough to carry through the trees, and Ethan stopped instantly, his body responding. Before thought could catch up, shoulders tightening slightly, head tilting just enough to listen, and the Doberman reacted at the same moment, not with movement forward or back, but with a sudden stillness that was deeper than before, more focused, his ears sharpening, his posture shifting in a way that spoke of recognition rather than curiosity, and Ethan felt it immediately. The difference in the air between a new sound and a remembered one, and he glanced down briefly, catching the change in the dog's stance, the subtle tension that had returned, not uncontrolled, not reactive, but contained, held tightly beneath the surface, and the sound came again, another sharp echo, followed by a pause, then another, and Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself, because the rhythm of it stirred something in him too, something he did not want to name, not here, not now, and he shifted his weight slightly, turning his body just enough to face the direction of the sound without stepping toward it. His hand relaxing at his side, open, visible, not reaching for the chain, not pulling, just present, and the Doberman's gaze locked forward, unblinking, his body angled toward the sound but not moving, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given, and Ethan watched him closely, not to correct, not to command, but to understand, because this reaction was not random, it was precise, shaped by something learned, something repeated, and after a few seconds, Ethan made a quiet decision. Not spoken, not formalized, just felt, and he stepped forward, one slow step toward the direction of the sound, not abrupt, not forceful, and then he stopped again, giving space, allowing the dog to choose, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, the silence stretching thin between them, and then the Doberman moved, not rushing, not pulling ahead, but stepping forward to match Ethan's direction, his body still tense but controlled, his focus unwavering, and Ethan nodded slightly, almost to himself, acknowledging the choice, because it was not obedience, it was alignment, and together they continued, deeper into the trees, toward a sound that did not belong to the quiet of the forest, a sound that carried with it something else, something unfinished, and as they moved closer, the air seemed to tighten again, not with danger, not yet, but with memory, the kind that does not fade easily, the kind that waits just beneath the surface for the right moment to return, and neither of them turned away. The sound grew clearer as they moved forward, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but defined, rhythmic, controlled, and Ethan slowed again, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because this was no longer just a direction, it was a location, and the trees began to thin slightly ahead, opening into a narrow stretch where the ground flattened and the light shifted just enough to reveal shapes beyond the branches. And he stopped just at the edge, his body instinctively lowering its profile. Without fully crouching, not hiding, just observing, and beside him, the Doberman mirrored the stillness, his posture tightening once more, not uncontrolled, but precise, like something inside him had aligned with the environment in a way that was not taught in this moment, but remembered from another, and through the thin veil of branches, Ethan could make out the outline of a fenced clearing. Metal posts driven into the ground at even intervals, wires stretched between them, not new, not temporary, but maintained, deliberate, and inside that space, movement, not chaotic, not aggressive, but structured, repeated, the kind of repetition that suggested training rather than randomness, and the sound came again, sharper now, followed by a pause, then a command voice, low but firm, carried just enough to reach them without revealing full words, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, because he knew that tone, that cadence, the kind that did not invite, only expected, and he glanced down briefly, catching the shift in the Doberman stance, the way his body angled forward, not to rush, not to react, but to focus, every line of him drawn toward that fenced space, and Ethan felt the connection settle into place, quiet but undeniable, because this was not curiosity, this was memory, and he exhaled slowly, grounding himself before moving again. One careful step forward, then another, stopping just short of full exposure, using the trees as cover without turning it into concealment, and from here, the scene became clearer, a small group of men inside the enclosure, dressed in neutral outdoor gear, moving with purpose, not hurried, not careless, and within the space, two dogs, both alert, both responding to commands with sharp, immediate precision, their movements exact, controlled, and something about it felt off. Not wrong in an obvious way, but incomplete, like a performance missing its intention, and Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, observing not just what was happening, but how it was happening, the spacing, the timing, the lack of variation, and beside him, the Doberman remained still, but the tension in him had changed, no longer just reaction, but restraint. As if something inside him recognized this pattern and chose not to engage with it, and Ethan noticed that too, the absence of forward movement, the absence of instinct to join, and it told him more than any report ever could, and he shifted his weight slightly, careful not to break the quiet, his gaze moving between the scene ahead and the dog beside him, connecting the two without forcing the conclusion, and after a moment, he leaned just slightly closer, his voice low, almost lost in the wind. "You have been here before," not a question, not an accusation, just a recognition spoken aloud, and the Doberman did not react outwardly, but his ears flicked once, a small, precise movement that carried more meaning than any bark could have, and Ethan held that moment, letting it settle, because whatever this place was, whatever had happened here before, it was not finished, and neither of them had walked into it by accident. The space between observation and action held for a moment longer, thin and fragile, as if the forest itself was waiting to see which way the balance would tilt, and Ethan remained still at the edge of the trees, eyes fixed on the fenced clearing, taking in every detail without rushing to interpret it, because something about this place resisted quick conclusions. It demanded patience, demanded presence, and inside the enclosure, the routine continued, commands spoken in low, controlled tones. Movements executed with precision, the dogs responding without hesitation, without variation, and that was what unsettled him most, not the structure itself, but the absence of anything outside it, no deviation, no adjustment, just repetition, and beside him, the Doberman held his ground, but the tension in him had shifted again, no longer just restraint, now layered with something deeper, something that felt like recognition wrapped in refusal, as if every instinct he had been shaped to follow was being consciously held back, and Ethan saw it, felt it, the quiet resistance that did not break form but refused to engage with it, and he exhaled slowly, lowering his gaze for a brief second before lifting it again, aligning his thoughts with what he was seeing rather than what he expected to see, and the pieces began to settle, not fully, not clearly, but enough to form the outline of something that did not belong, and he shifted slightly, adjusting his stance to remain concealed without retreating, his attention returning to the movements inside the fence, the spacing between handlers and dogs, the way commands were delivered without variation, the lack of acknowledgement between action and response, and it felt incomplete, not because it was ineffective, but because it was detached, stripped of something essential that could not be replaced by repetition alone, and he glanced down again, catching the Doberman's gaze still fixed forward, unblinking, and there was no confusion in it, no curiosity, just clarity, as if the dog already understood what Ethan was only beginning to piece together. And that realization settled quietly but firmly, because it meant this was not a new experience for him, this was a return, and Ethan leaned slightly closer, his voice barely above the whisper of wind through branches. "They trained you here, not as a question, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging what was already present between them," and the Doberman's ears flicked again, that same small, precise movement, followed by a subtle shift in posture, not stepping forward, not stepping back. Just adjusting, as if bracing against something unseen, and Ethan straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing just enough to focus on the men inside the enclosure again, observing not just the dogs now, but the handlers, their movements, their timing, the way they interacted with each other, and something about it felt too controlled, too contained, like a system designed to produce results without consideration for what those results required. And the sound came again, that sharp, mechanical crack, followed by immediate response from the dogs inside, their bodies snapping into motion with flawless precision, and Ethan felt the shift in the air beside him instantly, the Doberman's muscles tightening, not in reaction, but in resistance, and that was when it became clear, not fully, not yet, but enough, because this was not just training, this was conditioning, something deeper, something that shaped behavior by narrowing choice until only one response remained, and Ethan's jaw set slightly. Not in anger, but in recognition, because he had seen systems like this before, not here, not with animals, but the structure was familiar, the expectation of compliance without space for judgment, and he let out a slow breath, grounding himself in the present, because whatever this place was, whatever it had done, it was not finished, and the fact that the Doberman stood beside him now, choosing not to engage, choosing not to respond, said more than any evidence ever could, and Ethan took one small step back, not retreating, but resetting, creating just enough distance to think clearly, and the dog followed without hesitation, staying close, aligned, and for a moment, they stood there together, just beyond the edge of something neither of them had chosen to return to, but neither of them willing to ignore, because some places do not let go of what they have shaped, and some choices do not end where they were first made. The space between observation and action held for a moment longer, thin and fragile, as if the forest itself was waiting to see which way the balance would tilt, and Ethan remained still at the edge of the trees, eyes fixed on the fenced clearing, taking in every detail without rushing to interpret it, because something about this place resisted quick conclusions. It demanded patience, demanded presence, and inside the enclosure, the routine continued, commands spoken in low, controlled tones. Movements executed with precision, the dogs responding without hesitation, without variation, and that was what unsettled him most, not the structure itself, but the absence of anything outside it, no deviation, no adjustment, just repetition, and beside him, the Doberman held his ground, but the tension in him had shifted again, no longer just restraint, now layered with something deeper, something that felt like recognition wrapped in refusal, as if every instinct he had been shaped to follow was being consciously held back, and Ethan saw it, felt it, the quiet resistance that did not break form but refused to engage with it, and he exhaled slowly, lowering his gaze for a brief second before lifting it again, aligning his thoughts with what he was seeing rather than what he expected to see, and the pieces began to settle, not fully, not clearly, but enough to form the outline of something that did not belong, and he shifted slightly, adjusting his stance to remain concealed without retreating, his attention returning to the movements inside the fence, the spacing between handlers and dogs, the way commands were delivered without variation, the lack of acknowledgement between action and response, and it felt incomplete, not because it was ineffective, but because it was detached, stripped of something essential that could not be replaced by repetition alone, and he glanced down again, catching the Doberman's gaze still fixed forward. Unblinking, and there was no confusion in it, no curiosity, just clarity, as if the dog already understood what Ethan was only beginning to piece together, and that realization settled quietly but firmly, because it meant this was not a new experience for him, this was a return, and Ethan leaned slightly closer, his voice barely above the whisper of wind through branches. They trained you here, not as a question, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging what was already present between them, and the Doberman's ears flicked again, that same small, precise movement, followed by a subtle shift in posture, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting, as if bracing against something unseen, and Ethan straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing just enough to focus on the men inside the enclosure again, observing not just the dogs now, but the handlers, their movements, their timing, the way they interacted with each other, and something about it felt too controlled, too contained, like a system designed to produce results without consideration for what those results required, and the sound came again, that sharp, mechanical crack, followed by immediate response from the dogs inside, their bodies snapping into motion with flawless precision, and Ethan felt the shift in the air beside him instantly, the Doberman's muscles tightening, not in reaction, but in resistance. And that was when it became clear, not fully, not yet, but enough, because this was not just training, this was conditioning, something deeper, something that shaped behavior by narrowing choice until only one response remained, and Ethan's jaw set slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because he had seen systems like this before, not here, not with animals, but the structure was familiar, the expectation of compliance without space for judgment, and he let out a slow breath, grounding himself in the present, because whatever this place was, whatever it had done, it was not finished, and the fact that the Doberman stood beside him now, choosing not to engage, choosing not to respond, said more than any evidence ever could, and Ethan took one small step back, not retreating, but resetting, creating just enough distance to think clearly, and the dog followed without hesitation, staying close, aligned, and for a moment, they stood there together, just beyond the edge of something neither of them had chosen to return to, but neither of them willing to ignore. Because some places do not let go of what they have shaped, and some choices do not end where they were first made. The further they moved from the fence, the more the air seemed to loosen its grip, the tight rhythm of commands fading behind them until it dissolved into something distant, almost unreal, and Ethan did not stop immediately, he kept walking, slow but steady, letting the silence return on its own terms, not forcing it, not filling it, just allowing it to settle back into the space around them, and the path curved slightly, leading them away from the clearing and into a denser stretch of trees. Where the ground dipped gently, the frost thinning in patches where the earth held a little more warmth, and the sound beneath their feet softened again, each step absorbed rather than echoed, and beside him, the Doberman stayed close, closer than before, his presence no longer shaped by hesitation or restraint, but by something quieter, something more stable, and Ethan noticed it without looking directly, the subtle shift in how the dog moved, the absence of that earlier tension, and it did not feel like avoidance, it felt like release, controlled, deliberate, chosen, and after a few more meters, Ethan slowed to a stop near a fallen log that rested along the edge of the path, its surface worn smooth by time and weather, and he turned slightly, lowering himself onto it with a quiet exhale, elbows resting loosely on his knees, hands relaxed, not reaching for anything, not holding onto the chain, just letting it rest slack between them, and the Doberman paused a step ahead before turning back, his gaze settling on Ethan for a moment, reading, measuring, and then he stepped closer, circling once before lowering himself onto the ground a short distance away, not pressed in, not distant, just near enough to share the space without claiming it, and for a while. Neither of them moved, the forest holding its quiet around them, the wind brushing lightly through branches above, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth, and Ethan let his head dip slightly, eyes unfocused for a moment as the weight of what they had seen settled in, not overwhelming, not chaotic, just present, and he exhaled slowly, his voice low, almost lost in a stillness, that was not training, he said, not expecting a response, not needing one, just giving shape to the thought that had already formed, and the Doberman remained still, his breathing steady, his gaze calm, and there was no reaction, no shift, just quiet presence, and Ethan let that silence sit, because it was enough, more than enough, and after a moment, he straightened slightly, his posture no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but defined in a way that felt grounded rather than forced, and he reached down slowly, not to command, not to guide, but to gather the loose length of the chain, holding it lightly in his hand again, not as control, but as connection, and when he rose to his feet, the movement was smooth, unhurried, and the Doberman followed without hesitation, standing, aligning naturally at his side, and Ethan took a step forward, then another, turning back toward the path that would lead them out of the trees, not away from what they had found, but carrying it with them, and the direction was clear now, not because it had been planned, but because it had been understood, and as they moved, the forest seemed to open again ahead, the light shifting, widening, and the quiet between them held steady, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but something else entirely, something that did not need to be spoken to be known. The path widened as they moved out from under the trees, the forest slowly releasing its hold until the open sky returned above them, pale and quiet, stretching across the horizon without urgency, and Ethan did not rush his steps, he let the transition happen naturally, the shift from shadow to light settling into his awareness the same way everything else had that morning, gradual, deliberate, and beside him, the Doberman remained close, his movement steady, no longer shaped by hesitation or tension, but by something quieter, something grounded, and when they reached the edge of the tree line, Ethan paused again, not because he needed to, but because the moment asked for it, and he turned slightly, looking out across the open stretch of land ahead, the thin frost catching the light in small, muted reflections, the distant road barely visible beyond a gentle rise, and for a second, everything felt still, not empty, not silent, but complete in a way that did not need to be explained, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing as the weight of what they had seen settled into something more defined, not confusion, not doubt, but direction, and he glanced down at the dog beside him, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was no question there anymore, no uncertainty, just presence, steady and clear, and Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, not as a signal, but as acknowledgement, because whatever had been broken, whatever had been shaped or taken away, had not erased the ability to choose, and that choice had been made, quietly, without force, without command, and it mattered more than anything that had happened before, and he shifted his grip on the chain slightly, not tightening it, not using it, just holding it as it was, loose, unclaimed, and then he stepped forward again, moving out into the open, the frost crunching softly under his boots, and the Doberman followed without hesitation, not lagging, not pulling ahead, just aligned, and as they walked, the distance between where they had been and where they were going grew with each step. Not in meters, but in meaning, because they were not leaving something behind, they were carrying it forward, shaping what it would become next, and the wind moved gently across the open ground, brushing against them with a quiet, steady rhythm, and Ethan felt it, the clarity settling deeper now, not loud, not dramatic, just present, and he spoke once more, his voice low, steady, carried lightly by the air, "We are not done." Not as a declaration, not as a promise, but as a simple truth, and the Doberman did not react outwardly, did not change his pace or posture, but he stayed close, steady, present, and that was enough, more than enough, because some things did not need to be spoken to be understood, and as they continued forward, side by side, the open space ahead did not feel uncertain, it felt possible, and in that quiet, unspoken alignment, something new began, not with noise, not with force, but with a choice made twice, once by a man, and once by a dog, and that was where it held its meaning.